Okay, so we're going to talk today about how we uh, divide power up in government, how power systems can be spread out. And the first way we're going to talk about is through a unitary system. Now, a unitary system is where the central government has extreme authority and regional or subdivisional governments have only those powers given to them by the central government. So if we were to look at this as a chart, I'm going to give you a chart here, I think. Put it all together in one big swoop. Here we go. So if we look at a unitary system, all power is in the hands of the national government, and it can tell state and local governments what they can and cannot do. Great Britain's an example of this. France is an example of this. And in the United States, I should point out that local government stands in a unitary relationship with state government. I mean, yes, local government stands in a unitary relationship with state government. So if you look here in a unitary system where it says national government, imagine that saying state, and that arrow going down would be local government. The state tells local governments what they can and cannot do. Now, we don't use that in the United States as a whole, as the country as a whole, but at the local level, we do. And in fact, there's something called the Dillon Rule, which says that that the state creates local government and it can destroy it. It can tell us what we can and cannot do. So the unitary system nationwide, you'd find it in Britain and France. At the local level, you'll find it with state governments versus local governments, but it's an extreme concentration of power. Now, on the other hand of that, the other end of the spectrum is the Confederation. Now here, as you can look at this chart, the Confederation has, where the states have all the power and they can tell the national government what they can and cannot do. We've had confederations under the Articles of Confederation in 1789 to 1781, and then there was the Confederate States of America, 1861 to 1865. Neither worked out very well. But the idea of a confederation is it allows independent states to work together to solve common problems without giving up their autonomy. You can still be an independent nation but work with other nations, something like the UN today would be. Or if you were to go back during 1781 to 1789, you would see that if you were to ask somebody, what country are you from? They would say, my country is Massachusetts, or my country is Rhode Island. They wouldn't say, my country is the United States of America. They saw themselves as independent countries, and they had a loose union under this national government that would help them with certain affairs like foreign affairs and maybe international trade. Now, the problems with the Confederation, is that determining what is a common problem and what is a common solution. So confederations have had problems, but the Confederation, simply put, is a league of independent states in which the central government has only those powers given to them by the national government. So you can see where that power flow chart is coming from. It's the reverse of the unitary system. And it's an extreme dispersal of power. If a unitary system is an extreme concentration of power, then a confederation is an extreme dispersal of power. So why not somewhere meet in the middle where we can find a middle ground? And that's usually the federal system. Now, in a federal system, that is where power is divided, usually by a written constitution between the national government and state governments. Now, from this chart, you can see the people are at the top. That's true in a unitary system and a confederation. But power is divided between the national state governments by a written constitution. So you can tell federal system for these things that both can pass and enforce laws. Both state governments and national governments both can pass and enforce law. You can break state law, you can break federal law, you can go to jail for both. Both must consent to constitutional change. If we're going to change the Constitution, the national government has to propose amendments, states have to ratify. Both are supreme within their own sphere of authority. They both have areas where they have the last word. So for example, in states, it's the creation of local government. It's intra, that's I-N-T-R-A, state commerce, commerce that occurs only within the state. And the national government has its areas where it has the last word, things like interstate commerce, diplomacy, the coining of money. So they share powers. And then finally, the last major feature is that they're both indestructible. The national government is indestructible, the states are indestructible. Once you join as a state, you can't leave. There's this rumor constantly that Texas can leave, but there's actually a Supreme Court case in 1868-69 called Texas versus White, where Texas tried to leave the Union right after the Civil War, and the Supreme Court said no, that really once you join here, you're stuck here. I think the exact words were that the Constitution looks forward to an indestructible Union composed of indestructible states. Now, the advantages of the federal system is, one, it spreads out power, which prevents dictatorship, which means no one can get too much power. And we've seen that. Presidents get frustrated, Congress gets frustrated, governors get frustrated. Number two, it spreads out the national income. It allows the richer states to help the poorer states. You know, if you look at a state like New York, which is considered a rich state, it puts more money into the federal coffers than it gets out. Kentucky gets more money from the federal government than it puts in. And this is useful in spreading out the national income. Number three is that it supposedly cuts down on red tape. Red tape is meaning bureaucracy. And that may have been true in the 1800s when the dominant view of federalism was what we call dual federalism, or layer cake federalism, where you had the federal government just doing certain functions, post office, diplomacy, and international trade. And then everything else was the state. This is, like I said, layer cake. It's like two cakes separated by this frosting, which is the Constitution, and the two do not meet. So for the most part, back in the 1800s, the federal government did very little in regulation. And number four, it allows for experimentation. States can experiment to see if they've got a problem, they can try to work on a problem, and they've got the power to try to fix it. Now, the great thing about that is you've got 50 state governments, and if you have a problem, a state can solve that problem. Other states can look at it and go, well, that's a good idea. We're gonna adopt that solution. If it doesn't work, other states can say, well, we're not going to do that. Well, the disadvantages of federalism is that, number one, it's confusing. I mean, there are a lot of different governments. You probably live under 10 different governments that can regulate or tax you in some way, besides the federal government, the state government, the county government, the city government, the school district, your junior college district like TCC or DCCCD. Those are special districts. Water districts, the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport's a special district. There's special districts all over the place. And so for many Americans, it's hard to really keep up with it. So it is confusing. Number two, some would argue that it puts an unfair tax burden on the rich states. That Texas, for every dollar it puts into the federal gas tax, it gets 95 cents back, and that's money we could be using to fix roads. Number three, a lot of people say there's a lot of red tape. Now, I know this sounds like I'm contradicting myself from what I just said a few minutes ago, but starting with the FDR and the New Deal, we moved away from dual federalism to something what we call cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism is also called marble cake federalism because there's a commingling of state and federal governments. The federal government gives aids in terms of grants, and with that aid comes strings attached and allows the federal government to get its fingers into areas that maybe it shouldn't be, but because there's money attached, states have to follow it. And so you get a lot more regulations with this marble cake or cooperative federalism, which started around the time of the New Deal and FDR. And then number four, some would argue that experimentation doesn't work, that states don't want to experiment because it costs money to experiment. And that means tax money. And they rather just turn to the federal government to see if they can solve their problems. So that's examples of the three different ways we separate power. Usually we spend a lot more time in class. because we have a chance to actually go back and forth and talk about it, which is great, but not so easy here. So the next lecture that we'll talk about is really the beginnings of American government. We'll start with the Mayflower Compact and then move on to the Articles of Confederation, and then get ourselves into the Constitutional Convention.